Caffeinated Thoughts Podcast. Hi, this is Shane Vander Hart. Welcome to another episode. I just had a conversation yesterday with Michael Johnson, who's the president of the Slavic Gospel Association. His ministry is doing work in the former countries that are part of the former Soviet Union. And we talked about their latest project, Christ in the Midst of COVID. As you may know, obviously we in the United States are not the only ones impacted by COVID-19, but other countries are as well, and Russia has not had the best response, and things have been pretty difficult for your average Russians as well as the church. And anyway, we had a conversation about how his ministry is responding to this and how people can get involved. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Michael Johnson. Well, Michael, welcome to the Caffeinated Thoughts Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited about this.
Very welcome. So I don't know if my listeners are aware of your organization. You serve the Slavic Gospel Association. Tell us a little bit about that organization, how it got started, and what you guys do.
So the ministry was established in 1934 by a man named Peter Danica. He came to this country in the early part of the 20th century. He was from a small village in Belarus. There was a famine throughout that part of the country, and certain family members were dying, and so his father, when he was, I think he was like 14 years old, put him on a ship and sent him to the United States so he could secure employment and then send money back so that the families could survive. So he came to Chicago, got saved through the ministry of Moody Church, and one thing led to another. And when the persecution began to take hold in those countries, he started this ministry again in 1934. So during those years, the primary function of the ministry was the covert distribution of books and Bibles to Christians and through the churches. But then in partnership with radio ministries such as Transworld Radio, HCJB, and Far East Broadcasting, we developed the Russian language programming that was broadcast into those countries. Now, when the communists came out and said that they were going to eradicate all forms of God throughout those countries and put the last Bible under glass at a museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, we were broadcasting Christian radio programming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in, around, and through the Iron Curtain, and in order to keep those countries open for the gospel. And so it was a great blessing to the people that lived there, and their favorite program was basically a program where people would broadcast a radio program where they would simply read the scriptures slowly, so that people on the other end, in their attics and in their basements, could copy the scriptures down, put their Bibles together, and distribute it throughout their villages. So God used the ministry in significant ways. When the wall came down, we partnered with the largest group of evangelical churches in those countries, the Baptist churches, helped them to build their theological training infrastructure, seminaries, Bible institutes, different training programs, which was their biggest need because, as you know, Russia missed the Reformation, so there was no infrastructure.
Right.
And then we sponsored national church planting pastors. We sponsor hundreds of pastors who were then sent out into unreached towns and villages to plant new churches. And then we equipped those churches, as well as the broader network of churches, roughly 6,350 churches we're connected to. And when we equipped them to meet the physical needs and the spiritual needs of the people in their communities. So orphan ministries, humanitarian aid ministries. We're equipping those churches to minister in the war zone. There's still people suffering the effects of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, so we're helping in those areas. But also a lot of, we have airplanes out in the Far East Russia where we're doing a lot of church planting activities there. And so we really follow the ministries of those churches over there and equip them and their churches to expand their ministry outreach through resources and financial aid.
Obviously, evangelism is easier now that the Soviet Union is no longer. But I'm sure there's probably still challenges with because the Russian government, I wouldn't say exactly is the model of democracy. Um,
Yeah.
what kind of challenges are you seeing right now with the particular with President Putin in charge and and an
Well,
autocratic government?
yeah. Yeah, so there were some there were laws a number of years ago that restricted some evangelistic activities. For example, evangelizing children. There's certain limitations to that. And then there's some level of harassment against the evangelical churches. So, for example, they for the main seminary in Moscow, they pulled their license recently, and they're working to try to get that back. Churches are being fined for various reasons. So, but I would say that overall, there's more freedom
Sure.
to evangelize and preach the gospel in those countries than there was before the wall came down. But
Okay.
and the other thing is that, these guys, I mean, their fathers and their grandfathers and their pastors, many of these people were taken away in the middle of the night and sent out to Siberia, and they were martyred for their faith. So, I mean, they understand what it's like to practice your faith in a country like this where there's persecution. So they sort of expect it. I mean, Jesus said,
Right.
"Because I was persecuted, you'll be persecuted," right?
Well,
So, but for me, just real quick, for me, I just feel privileged to be able to serve these churches. I mean, I feel privileged to carry their bags because those churches are being built on a foundation of great persecution and sacrifice, and they're really dedicated to taking advantage of the time that they have to share the gospel with those in their cities, towns, and villages.
right. Well, before we started recording, you were telling me a little bit about how you got involved. How did you come? You were an advertising executive, and now you're leading a missionary organization. Talk to us about
Yeah,
that process.
it is interesting. God sort of has a sense of humor here. So I got saved back in 1974 in California. It was on the tail end of the Jesus movement. And so I spent a couple years in a Bible Institute and then finished my undergraduate work. And one thing led to another. And one second, I'm sorry. I had to clear my throat. So I ended up met my wife. She worked in the advertising business, and we ended up moving back to New York City, where I served some large consumer brands. So I worked on the television campaigns for brands such as Tide detergent and Tylenol pain medication, and so I loved the advertising business, and I was having a great time. And we lived in Manhattan for 3 years, and then we lived out in Brooklyn. And so I was active in our church in Brooklyn, and a man by the name of Bob Provost came and spoke at our missions conference that I had organized. And he sort of lit the church on fire for international missions. And he organized a short-term missions trip to the country of Albania. And we went there, and God began to open my eyes to what he was doing in the former Soviet countries. This would have been in the early 90s. And eventually he came to this ministry as the president, and I was in the middle of a transition. I was just given my dream job offer in New York City, and he called me and asked if I would consider transitioning out of advertising into ministry to help him, quote, his line was to me, "We have a great story to tell about what God is doing a half a world away through those faithful churches in the former Soviet Union, and we need a professional like you to tell that story." So I came, and on the same day I got the job offer in New York. He offered me the job to come to the ministry, and my wife and I looked at each other and said, "This is where God is leading us." So we came here in the mid-'90s. I was here for about 7 years. The Lord called me to other activities. And I went off and I consulted with hundreds of faith-based organizations, helping them in their fundraising and marketing and communications programs. And then when Dr. Provost retired, the board brought me back as the president. So I've been here since May of 2017.
All right. So you guys have a campaign or program. I don't know exactly what you call it, but it's called Christ Over COVID. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, when with the onset of the virus, I began to pray about how we might be able to assist the churches in this new reality that we had found ourselves in.
Mm-hmm.
I had worked with SIM on a program during the Ebola crisis called Pray to End Ebola, and so I went back and looked at some of the underlying strategies for that, and I came, and the Lord sort of opened up the doors for this particular campaign. So the first thing that I recognized, and I think and I recognize the same thing the churches do, and that is that this COVID situation, even though it's an extremely difficult situation where a lot of people are suffering, I think it's the greatest opportunity, or the most significant opportunity, for the proclamation of the gospel in those countries since the wall came down. Mm-hmm. And the reason is I'm sure you talked to other people about this, is that people are looking around and there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about what the future holds. People are thinking, if I walk into the Costco and I pick up the virus, I'll be gone in a couple of weeks, and where am I going to spend eternity? And so our foundations are being shaken, both here as well as in those countries. But in this country, we have a pretty strong infrastructure, so that those people who are affected by it, at least can survive. But in those countries over there, with the onset of what happened, in Russia in particular, their economy is primarily based upon the price of oil, and that market crashed. Mm-hmm. And so many people have lost their jobs. Many people have lost their apartments, and they're just really struggling. And again, they don't have the infrastructure to meet their needs. So in Moscow represents about 2/3 of the assets of a country that's roughly 10 time zones long. So in Moscow, there's some level of safety net, but once you get out into the cities, towns, and villages, there really isn't nothing there. There really isn't anything there. So in those cases, the churches, are really, in many situations, the churches are their only source of hope and resources. So we have a network of roughly 6,350 churches that we're connected to across 10 countries. We can get resources and humanitarian aid to the exact point of need in just about any part of those countries. So the first thing we did, we developed a worldwide call to prayer that we call Christ Over COVID, Much Prayer, Much Power. We have thousands and thousands of people praying on a daily basis who are receiving daily updates through an email program that we're doing. And then we're raising funds, and we're transferring the funds out to those different regions. They are purchasing food, dividing them into food packets. Many of those churches are aware of people who are in need, but they'll also go to their local governments to get the list of people who are in desperate need. And they go around and they develop food, and they distribute food packets to folks. They sit with them, they pray with them, and there's many, many opportunities for them to share the gospel with them. The food packets generally last 5 to 10 days for a family of 4, and then they'll return with another one, continue to build on the relationship. And many, many, many people have heard the gospel, and many people have come to faith in Christ as a result of this wonderful ministry. So we're really, the church is being lifted up in those countries. I mean, they're lights in dark places. In the war zone in eastern Ukraine, we have significant ministry there, and those people had already been suffering, but it's just getting worse for them. Mm-hmm. And this is, our partnership with those churches has just opened up tremendous doors and opportunities for the spread of the gospel, and God is blessing it in significant ways.
Great. So, what are some stories you've been hearing since this launched?
Well, let's see.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Some stories yesterday. No. I'll share one with you. I'll tell you one story. Lyra, 38 years old. She has 2 children. One's 5 years old. The other one's 6 years old. One of the father was killed, and the other one, she doesn't have any contact with them. It got so desperate that she turned to prostitution to support her kids.
Oh, wow.
And the local church connected with her, and they led her to Christ. And now she and the children she's attending church, and the children are attending the Sunday school. And the church has reached out to meet her to share the love of Christ with her. She repented of her sin, and now she's a believer, and she's coming to church on a regular basis, and she's part of the church family. So we have another one, Vanya, who lives in a poor village in the war zone, and the mother's an alcoholic. She beats him. His older brother beats him, and it's a very dysfunctional situation. So he ends up just wandering the streets at night and has nowhere to go. And so the local church connected with him, invited him into the church, and gave him some food, and put together a food packet so he could go home and give it to his family. And the family softened to him and softened to the gospel. And now the mother's coming to church, and Vanya's attending Sunday school on a regular basis. So it really is. It's those are just a couple of the many ones that we receive. We do a lot of work. We have a ministry called Orphans Reborn, and so we equip workers to go into state-run orphanages on a weekly basis to minister to children and share the gospel with them and conduct Bible studies. In many cases, those orphanages have been shut down because the funding disappeared. Yeah. And in many of those kids are what they call social orphans, and so they're taken out of their homes because of violence and dysfunction, and now they're being put back into those dysfunctional homes. And so the workers in those villages are very concerned about it, so they will visit the kids on a regular basis and deliver humanitarian aid to the families, and just obviously to make sure they're okay, but also share the love of Christ with them. So because it's done on a local basis, there's a real personal touch to this ministry, not only in terms of the ability to share the gospel with these folks, but also to follow up and begin the discipleship process with them as well. And so that's why we're seeing such tremendous fruit.
Great. So how can people get involved with SGA?
Well, we have a website that's sga.org. And if you're interested in this particular ministry, it's sga.org/COVID. And again, you can sign up, and we receive so many reports on a daily basis that we are filtering those reports back 5 days a week through this updated prayer email that we send. So it's a report on somebody whose life has been impacted, and there's a devotional attached to it, and there's specific prayer requests. And again, we have many people praying with us on a regular basis, and God is blessing. God is answering those prayers, because one of our specific prayers is that God would open the hearts of the people in those countries to hear His word, and that He would direct His workers to those individuals in whose hearts He is working. And we are seeing story after story after story where that specific prayer is being answered.
Great. So are there any ways for people to, beyond prayer, beyond giving, to directly get involved with your ministry?
Well, it's in some cases we do have some short-term missions trips that we have organized to go over there, but that's not going to open up for many months to come.
Right.
There's not. I mean, we're sort of what we call an equipping ministry. So we equip the churches overseas to do that, and so many of our supporters will actively support these missionary pastors and their families as they're working in these previously unreached towns and villages. So we filter, regular reports back to them about the activities of their church planners that they support. So that's one way. But because it's a half a world away, it's difficult for people to actively participate. I mean, I used to raise money for a lot of rescue missions, and the rescue missions are in the communities. They have tremendous opportunities for people to come in and volunteer. But because of the distance, it's kind of difficult. But
right.
But for us, we have more stories about life change in this ministry, and I've consulted with hundreds of Christian nonprofit organizations. I've never seen anything like this before, and so people are just blessed to see the way in which God is working in the hearts and the lives of these people, and that's how people get excited about what you're doing.
All right. Well, hey, Michael, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And
you're very welcome.
We'll have to have you back on for an update down the road. So God bless
Yeah,
you.
yeah. So right now, just real, yeah. So
Yeah,
again,
go
right
ahead.
now we're at 1.1. We're at 1.6 million distributed meals, and we want to
Mm-hmm.
continue to grow that, and as the Lord provides. So,
Great.
amen.
Well, God bless you.
Okay,
And again, that's
great. Thank you
SG.
very much.
Hey, you're very
Okay.
welcome. And again, listeners, it's sga.org. And actually looking at his website right now, or the organization's website, and there's a link to the Christ Over COVID right on the homepage. So
Mm-hmm.
just go to sga.org and sign up. So thank you so much, and God bless you.
God bless you as well.
All
Thanks.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that concludes today's episode of the Caffeinated Thoughts podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you happen to be listening to this podcast somewhere other than on our website, please be sure to check out caffeinatedthoughts.com. Again, that's caffeinatedthoughts.com. Or you could just Google at the Caffeinated Thoughts and it'll show up at the top of your screen. Also, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, sign up so you can get our emails. That way you don't miss a single update. And, subscribing to our podcast, it's probably more convenient for you and it's better for us. That way you don't miss a single episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts if you like us, or if you follow us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts. Please give us a 5-star rating. If you don't like what you hear, and just forget I said anything about rating us. So we're also on Podbean, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. If there's an app we're missing, please drop me a line at shane@caffeinatedthoughts.com, and I'll try to see if I can make that happen. Until next time, my friends, thank you for listening. Have a great weekend. Take care.